Let you know is not only I welcome the people here in the room, but also we have people attending online. So one of the things I very much ask you to do is we will be running around with microphones. Please wait until we get the microphone onto you, so this way people who are attending virtually can hear everything as well. We understand that discussion happens spontaneously, so we promise to get to the microphone to you as quickly as possible before the thought leaves. So just kind of be aware of that. Another thing, like I said, not only are we broadcasting out the meeting, we're also recording it. And one of the things we do on the FSN Network website, by later this week, we will put up the recorded session. So if you know someone who's missed it, this is a way that they can get caught up on what was said. Or if you just want to review a point that's had, the recording will be up there. We will also be posting all the other materials for this consultation, as we have done already for the one that we had last week. And speaking of that, the third consultation will be next Wednesday on the 11th. It'll be a little longer. It'll be from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m., but that includes lunch. So, you know, we will feed you, make sure you can sustain your energy. And that one will be on conflict-sensitive sensitive programming. So we hope you can join us for that. Okay. Today, we have two presenters from USAID Office of Food for Peace. One is Joan Whalen, who's the Senior Policy and Program Coordination Officer, and the second one is John Lamb, who's a Food for Peace Officer. So they will be the ones who are leading the session for us. Okay, well, the first thing I'd like us all to do is get to know each other. So if you can get up and find a partner, preferably someone you don't know, and introduce yourself, give your name, your organization, and also talk a little bit, give a reason or two as to why you are interested in social protection or safety nets. So if you could please go ahead and do that, we'd really appreciate it. So come on, get up and meet your neighbors. Thank you. Please wrap up your conversations. Appreciate it. Okay, so if I could ask for volunteers, if anybody would like to share what they learned from the person they were talked to, is how they got interested in social protection and safety nets. Anybody like to share? The lovely Madeline will get you the microphone if you'd like to share with us. Thank you.
So this is Colette. Colette is the CRS. She is part of the agri-business, new business kind of development team. And she's very interested in looking at social protection as a means to support smallholder agriculture families, farmers to recover after emergencies, after crisis, and see how that can be kind of nurtured out of the crisis context through a social protection approach. Does that sum it up? Yes.
Wonderful. Anybody else would like to share? Come on, just one. It's still early, yeah, that's true. We'll get another cup of coffee. Patrick, anyone online? No? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for sharing very much. One thing I forgot to mention is when we do post the resources for the meeting, we will be sending out an email to all the registrants plus the FSN network community, so you'll know, you don't have to keep checking our website, you'll know when the information is ready for you. Okay, and so right now I would like to introduce John Lamb. He's from the Office of Food for Peace, and he will be running our first section for us. Thank you.
Yeah, there we go. All right, are we using microphones? Can people hear?
Sure.
All right, fantastic. All right. Yeah, so we'll keep this pretty brief, but we just wanted to get started and talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about safety nets and social protection. That way we're all kind of using the same terms and thinking the same way. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started with this. So first of all, we wanted to start broad brush, social protection. So this is a collection of programs. One of the important things to understand is that safety nets are a form of social protection, but of course there are lots of other types of social protection as well. When we talk about safety nets, a lot of times we also talk about things that maybe aren't what all of us do on a regular basis with humanitarian programming. So social net protection can include assistance, which is kind of a lot of what we do. It can be cash transfers, it can be food, it can be subsidies of some types, but it can also be things like social insurance, so pensions, disability, and other things that ILO and some of the labor ministries and so forth do. And while we don't mind talking about some of that and how we can engage with some of those systems, it is kind of useful for us to recognize that also some of these things are probably not going to be the focus of really our discussions today. So all of these are kind of broadly included within what we consider social protection. And then to drill down a little bit more, what we're talking about is protecting the chronically poor. So it's not just what happens in emergencies, although it can include emergency programming as well. We prevent the vulnerable from being decimated, and we promote livelihoods. So people talk about these as 3 Ps. Some of the definitions on the 4th time here, but this is really what we're trying to focus on today. So in general, we are looking at programming that can be both emergency and development in nature, or. And we're looking at helping the most vulnerable. So move on. Looking at social safety nets, we're talking about non-contributory transfer programs. So to contrast this, we're not really talking about social insurance programs, although again, this is something that we can link to, and it can be a part of our programming. But usually when we talk about safety nets, we're talking about something that's provided with limited conditionality. It might be attend school, it might be do a work project, something like that. But typically they're not having to invest their own resources in terms of their own income, labor they may have to contribute. It is part of a broader system. A lot of times we will be talking about systems when we talk about safety nets and when we talk about social protection. And when we talk about what effective safety nets do, it is redistribution, even if that redistribution is actually for us as donors, from big country to other countries, or it could be within a country from those who have to those who have not. But also, we're talking a little bit about what some of the terms we talk about with resilience, in terms of managing risk, in terms of enabling households to make productive investments. So we've got a number of different attributes down here. One of them I would point out is this incentive compatible. So one of the things that we try to do with safety nets is avoid undermining other systems. So we try to look at what effects we're going to be having, and they need to be dynamic, which means that they need to be able to respond to changes, especially in some of the contexts we operate in, where very often the context and who needs assistance in what ways may have to change. All right, so looking for more specifically about what we're trying to do as the Office of Food for Peace, this is just kind of a starting point for us. These are some of the things that we try to do generally, but this is certainly going to be a large part of what we're talking about today, is what is our role as Food for Peace. We want to strengthen capacity of governments when we can. We want to coordinate pretty much all of the time. And then in some cases, we're really going to be delivering safety net programming ourselves. And in that context, we've got a number of different issues that we need to be thinking about in that regard. When is it really appropriate for us to be trying to do safety nets as opposed to supporting government or non-government systems that already exist, or helping bring those online? So certainly when we talk about crises, this is a big issue. We've also been talking about some of these other areas that we may end up working with development programming in the future. So anyway, I think with that, we want to go ahead and get started with success.
Yeah, and just see if others have other thoughts.
Yeah, sure.
Do others have other thoughts about any of what John has said, or about what social protection or safety nets mean to you?
This would also be a good time if we want to talk about kind of framing comments for kind of discussion for today, if anyone has any thoughts. No? Maybe? Carl?
John, where do community-based safety net programs fit into this schema? And what is Food for Peace's role in supporting those?
It's a good question. I think we'll be getting into that a little bit as we discussed today. In general, we want to make sure that we're not undermining community-based systems. We want to make sure we're aware of them. And the degree that we can support them directly depends a lot on how the system's structured. There are going to be certain types of traditional systems where the easiest thing to do is just kind of to give it room to work. There are going to be other types of systems where we can talk about kind of incentives and ways that we can kind of promote people getting into systems that are already in place, or to fill a niche where you say, all right, well, the system covers people here, and there's something that helps, say, the orphans and widows here, but then there's certain gaps here where there isn't really a good system, and so that's probably what we'd be trying to do, is understand where the gaps are, coordinate with other actors that are trying to do things, and very importantly, be aware of what's going on and try to understand the system very well. Any other questions? All right, well, I think we can move on then. Oh, sure.
Going back to the slide with all of the, what makes a good fit.
Yes,
They should
yeah,
be
yeah.
equitable. Can I just have a...
All right.
I'm reading this, and I think this is true, but I just wonder, do you think this is easy to achieve? Do you think this is ever achieved? Brigitte is absolutely laughing. So partly it is. I mean, these are wonderful principles. Brigitte, maybe do you want to say anything about your work on PSNP? Certainly, just what's the reality of?
Sure. So I'm Brigitte Rollier, and I've been working on Ethiopia for the last 6 years and backstopping programs, partners who implement the Productive Safety Net program in Ethiopia, which is probably the largest safety net program in Africa, not the world, I don't know. But there are many, many challenges to good implementation, and I see here, for example, that these are really important elements of a safety net, but very difficult to achieve, especially when you have limited funding, for one thing. It's difficult to be completely inclusive of all the vulnerable sometimes because there just isn't sufficient funding. Dynamic is also can be a challenge because a big safety net can be very entrenched, and trying to get people to look at different ideas and different ways of doing things, that can also be a challenge. So those are just a couple of thoughts that I had, but there are many challenges associated with each of those ideals, I would say.
Yeah, and I think these are excellent goals, and I think that it's something really good for all of us to keep in mind as we talk today, because that is what we want out of our programs. The reality check is that it's very difficult depending on the capacities in the country, the context that we're working in, political will, so many factors, and we're going to be talking through a lot of that today. So yeah, thank you, John, for putting these up here, because it is probably not that easy to hold up any safety net program and say, well, yeah, we've done it, we're there, because there are so many choices that have to be made and so many gaps. Yes, please.
Alan Jury, Food Program USA. I think maybe the way to look at that last sentence is there must be at least a semi-realistic path to get there. I mean, if you can't see any way that this program can ever be sustainable, then you may need to rethink it. If it's a question of there's not the resources now, there's not capacity now, but there's at least a not completely fantasy way to maybe eventually get there. If the right decisions are made, the right resources are applied to any of these, then maybe that's a more realistic. Because if you don't really see them have a chance to reach, maybe not all of them, but most of them, then are you really doing a safety net? Or are you doing a one-off kind of program? And that's I think skeptics of safety nets worry that's what it really is. It's a kind of it's a kind of self-contained welfare program that doesn't really have a long-term, while the proponents of it, WPUSA, think it can be a lot more than that. And if you don't at least show those realistic paths toward that, then it's hard to make that point.
Just to add to that, I think this is aspirational. These are kind of principles that we try to design on, and I think that often that means that there will be some variety on how sustainable you're going to have one country's system is going to be than another. Certainly we recognize there's going to be vastly different contexts that we operate in, and that too is something I think we'll want to be discussing a lot today. Is how do we work in one area as opposed to another? I think in general we want to make sure that we're thinking about all these things and trying to achieve them. And if we have a system that is fundamentally not equitable or fundamentally not cost effective, then we have issues. So I definitely agree with that. It's very difficult to find a model where you say it's 100% all of these. So I think it is right to think of these as principles, really.
Yeah, and to always be thinking of the pathway going forward. You're right on. And from our online community.
Yeah, we just had a few comments come in online. Bethany Brown commented that social protection for us is in line with the Social Protection Floor Initiative of the ILO. Non-contributory systems are crucial for the resilience of older people. Older people are often productive, but not producing an income. And then Kristen Bibber of Boise International said that preserving dignity and respecting local cultures is an important piece for her. And Joseph Agnekan commented that social protection is like a buffer to the shocks to livelihoods of the vulnerable.
Okay. So, I don't know if you want to have a seat. We're going to just brainstorm for a few minutes now. And with this stage set, we want to take a few minutes and just brainstorm a little bit. We're going to start with talking about government systems. And what have you seen, or what do you think Food for Peace should be doing to support government-led safety net systems? What are some activities we engage in to help make them a reality and help make them happen and help make them aspire to our principles? And do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm Sujata Ghosh. I'm with FHA 360, the Planter Project. And I went a couple of years ago to Haiti to participate in the startup of the safety net program there. And their FFP's role was to begin a pilot of the safety net in a few regions of Haiti. Mm-hmm. So I thought, that really made a lot of sense, because you can bring in a lot of external expertise to that sort of environment where you're piloting a new intervention before you decide whether you're going to scale it up or not.
Okay, so bringing in external expertise. Okay, so capacity building and also modeling something that could be replicated.
Evaluating its effectiveness, helping with that.
Okay.
I have one.
Oh yeah, hi Paula.
Hi.
And please introduce yourself.
I'm Paula Bertolin, and I also work at Food for Peace. I would put there a major role that we have to play in a country where we're working is donor coordination, being in touch with that, not necessarily leading it, but just being aware of what everyone else is doing, and making sure that we're not working at odds with each other at a minimum, but hopefully coordinating.
Oh, good. Okay.
Civic action against hunger. I think one of the values added from an outsider perspective as a community of practice, I think, is as well the use of data to make informed decisions for governments. So creating the necessary data, but then helping them as well, not just to have the data sit there, but use it actively to make decisions on who to target, what to change in terms of the dynamic, for instance, when to change it from food to cash or the other way around. and all of those things. So the use of data available to make necessary decisions on changes or adjustments to the system itself.
Okay, so enabling data-driven safety net programs, okay. Anything else? We talked about piloting, but what about just building government capacity? And I think we do a lot that way, don't we? Brigitte is saying yes.
Yeah, oh yeah, I mean, through our partners, do a lot of work, on building government capacity. Sorry, yeah, we do a lot of work through our partners on building government capacity, but, I guess my question is, I'm only familiar with the Ethiopia context, but is the first step getting buy-in from the government at the top level to start up a safety net and to convince them or work with them to understand how they can benefit from getting started a safety net in their country?
That's an important piece, isn't it? Yeah, thanks.
I'm Mara.
If you could wait for a microphone, just because the online people will hear everything.
I'm Mara, and I work at Food for Peace, and just to add to Bridget's getting buy-in, I don't know if that's implicit in that statement, though, is the capability, the financial capability of the government. So working with them with regard to their budget and how to allocate resources to that, because I think what we see oftentimes is, oh, this safety net is this great idea, and yes, we should try and do it, and we don't think about how their line items and their budgets are organized. And if we have, or if they are willing to let us in, us meaning
very much at a household level, but when you get down, visit individual households, I think it's quite common, you know, sort of, that households are not always fully understand who's eligible for the safety net program and why. Like, why is the government making these choices? And there's a fair amount of a lack of trust. So I think in addition to build the capacity of the government, to build their capacity to effectively communicate what they're doing, why they're doing, how to engage households and how to engage a community.
Okay. Great. Okay.
Then we had a comment online. And this is from Debbie Walton of World Vision. She says promoting local procurement opportunities is important.
Okay.
So she'd like that added.
Jerry, I know the focus should, and I think today should be primarily on Food for Peace's operational role, but I really think Food for Peace has a role with the rest of government in explaining and really articulating the role of safety net and comprehensive food systems. To be honest, if you talk to Feed the Future, if you talk to USDA like we do, I've never seen anybody in government make a presentation about the role of safety nets when they're talking food security, other than Food for Peace. And Food for Peace needs to be an advocate for this role, because some of this stuff on capacity building and financing and long-term capacity is going to require pulling other parts of the U.S. government into it. It's not all going to be a Food for Peace job.
That's a very good point. That is a very good point. And this is isolated, I hope, but I have heard people at USA say, oh, USA doesn't do safety net programming. Very significant budget line item is actually. Yeah, yeah. So no, it's a point very well taken.
We got a couple more comments come in from online. So Christian Vibert of OIC International suggested that Food for Peace could help with data and information sharing across partners. And then Debbie Walton also added influencing national policies and program is another role that Food for Peace could play.
Great. And, sorry, what was the last one? Influencing
National policies and programs.
Okay, and then of course the elephant in the room is just the direct resource transfers that happen too, that it is part of the programming. It's funny that no one mentioned that. Do you have one more on government led?
One more.
Okay. Actually, I can probably put it on the same page, because we'll move on to community support.
Right, yeah. No, I would just have one other, and that is four countries are kind of further along on the spectrum with this. Engaging with social safety nets when we're doing emergency programming, I think is also a big one for us, is making sure that if we know they already have registries of vulnerable populations, they already have programs to help, a lot of times, I wouldn't say all the time, but when we have these rapid onset disasters, often there are opportunities to link into an existing system, and that can be a big advantage for us.
Okay, great.
So just to shift gears for,
Sorry, I just was gonna, excuse me. I was just gonna comment on the last point about the funding. I was gonna mention, because a lot of that goes to WFP, then our influence, excuse me, engaging with WFP in the boardroom and on their safety net policy, and as can impact then the resources and what direction they're heading and all of that.
okay, so that's kind of linked to donor coordination, is also influencing multilateral, let's see, and there. So just to shift gears for a minute and just think, do we need to think differently about it if we're focusing on community-led safety net systems or social protection systems? And how does it look different if we do so? What are some of our roles in those cases, or what are necessary steps that we need to take? So we do a lot of work with government-led systems, but I think we also, sometimes indirectly, but and certainly we need to be striving to support and not undermine. What are some of our roles with regard to more traditional systems or community-led social protection activities? Okay.
I'm tempted to say that you almost need like an in-depth anthropological study of these communities before you actually get involved and go in, because there are lots of different overlapping layering of reciprocal obligations and power structures and relationships in these communities. And if we don't know about those before we go in, we really risk doing more harm than good, I think.
Okay. Really interesting suggestion, and it's one that came up last week too, in terms of talking about social accountability systems, really needing to understand the dynamics at work in the communities that we're working in, and leaving space for that in-depth analysis and the updating of that analysis, and really looking at how we're affecting, if we're affecting those dynamics. That's a very good suggestion. Anything else? Here we go.
Thank you. This is Michael from Action Against Hunger. I was thinking of empowering the community, to hear the voice of the community, to understand exactly what they need, instead of imposing ideas. So that works better. And it's also good to focus on environmental sensitive programs because it will have a long-term impact in making it sustainable. So the environment should be also the center of the safety net for me.
Environmental impact.
Yeah,
Okay.
environmental sensitive programs.
Okay. Okay. So just the first part, will say for those of you that were here last week, and we talked a lot about social accountability systems and what they look like, and you've addressed that in that need to have the trust of the community and a community that feels empowered to make their needs known, and some ways for whether it's the implementer or the local government to be listening and responding. So that's really important. And then, okay, environmental sensitivity. That's great. Thank you. Anyone else? Up here, and then Brigitte.
Amber from City Foundation. Going off of the empowerment of the local community, one thing that we do is to establish trust is to engage the local leaders, school teachers, their doctors, maybe their church leaders as well. That's one way to empower.
I think wherever you're plugging in, whether it's at this level or at the community level, I think you always have to aim for programming that empowers women and doesn't undermine women, and that doesn't promote or foster or enable gender inequitable dynamics.
Right. Okay. Good addition. Okay. So Ms. Sujata behind Brigitte.
Yeah, I think another role which Food for Peace can play, and I think already does play in some contexts, is where it's deemed appropriate to help some of these community-led systems become aware of other resources and other organizations that might be available to them with whom they can form linkages to help further their objectives.
I think another one, which counts actually for both the government level as well as the community level, is I think we have a lot of space to grow better on exit strategies. And that doesn't mean we're finishing on X day, but really having a plan of transition and handover. And if we're talking about sustainability, the only way we're going to get there is to have a very clear exit strategy from the very beginning. Consider the business plan. How are you going to hand over this business of social safety nets on community level or country level to the locally empowered management or leadership? So I think we need to work a bit stronger on that as well, and just having a better vision on how can we transition this and make it sustainable through a process, of course, but I think it is way too rarely considered in the very beginning.
Okay, and we will talk about that. It's one of our small group discussion questions later. But there are certain activities you would engage in the course of. So that's really how you work rather than what you do.
We had a couple of comments from online.
Okay.
So the first one just supported the gender-sensitive programming. This is from Bethany Brown of Help Age USA. She said, more directly relating to food security, the continued disempowerment of women of all ages and their lack of access to and ownership of productive resources and participation in decision-making process undermines sustainable change. And then from Joan Jennings of the TOPS program, she noted that linking to last week's session on social accountability, listening to community perspectives on whether systems are equitable, and also whether or not there are marginalized populations.
Okay. So I think we got some of those in other comments, but yeah, it's new. Right. Okay.
Abby Burrell, Concern Worldwide.
I think linked to the gender analysis, but I think that inclusion of all vulnerable groups and bringing them in to the fray, and also consulting with them and doing that analysis, and also ensuring that their needs are being met as well. I think it's not just women and girls, but it's the youth, it's the elderly, it's disabled, it's whomever, but and bringing those in because they're the ones who often need the greatest protection and also those safety nets as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So specific steps to really look at inclusivity, and so a lot of this. That's funny. I hadn't expected there to be so many strong links between last week's session and this one, but it's turning out very quickly that we really can't do good social safety net programs without good social accountability systems. And so those of you that missed last week's session, where that's maybe not an entirely familiar topic, I urge you to listen to the broadcast, the recording of the session, and we'll have some kind of documentary notes from it soon, and some key findings down the road. Okay, so this was taking a really broad brush look at this, but we're going to drill down now and say, okay, it's another reality check, and that we have different contexts that we work in. And I think there's a handout, maybe somebody could get around to the table now. Where's the thing? Okay, so we're going to talk about 3 contextual models really quickly. I don't know if you want to talk about these at all, John, or yeah. We've got a handout as well where you can read. But...
All right. Yeah. So this is getting back to looking at different contexts where we operate. For Food for Peace, we work in a wide range of environments, ranging from disasters in the Philippines and so forth to some of the most fragile states in the world, and places where there's arguably barely a state still in place. So obviously, how we're going to engage when we want to work in one place to another is going to be quite different. And so to help kind of frame this discussion, we want to talk about 3 different kind of models. Now, in the first one, this is kind of worst case scenario. We have a constrained model where humanitarians are limited by domestic actors, government, others perpetuating conflict, trying to do safety nets in a place like, let's say, Syria or Somalia or South Sudan. There are things we can do, but it severely limits what we're able to do, and we have to think very strongly about how we want to go in and how long we want to be there. So this is kind of our first model to look at, and this is not the ideal, but we're kind of moving in that direction. So we start off with what can we do when a very constrained situation? Can we still do safety net programming, and what does it look like? The second one we want to look at is the comprehensive model. So here we don't have anybody trying to actively undermine the efforts of humanitarians, but at the same time, the government is not realistically in a position to offer many services. And this is where, as humanitarians, we often wind up doing provision of assistance. So we want to talk about this one a little bit in terms of what our role needs to be in those situations. And this also is going to relate significantly to what we think in terms of sustainability, in terms of exit strategies, or transition strategies. There may not be a short-term exit strategy, but at least what you hope to achieve in the long run. Ideally, we're not permanently in comprehensive situations. We don't want to be indefinitely providing assistance in situations where we're completely replacing what we would see as kind of inherent government functions. And then the third option, and this is kind of the ideal for us when possible, is a cooperative model. And that's where we're supporting other service providers, particularly the government, but not just the government, also the community-based institutions, local NGO presence, and so forth. And so this is a third model where we can really hope to have kind of more meaningful long-term gains. But again, it's kind of a different concept for us as Food for Peace to think about what our role is. What does it look like when we're not doing service provision and we're not doing emergency response? So these are kind of the three contexts that we wanted to talk about today.
Good. So you all have a handout. I'll just go back to the slide. You all have a handout with more detail about each of those three models. But take the next 30 minutes. So that is going to be, what time, Sheila, would 30 minutes be?
30 minutes will be exactly 10:13.
Okay, so at about 10:15 we go break. But talk until then. But take each of these models and then think again, what would an appropriate program look like that could make sure that through safety nets and social protection, the most vulnerable populations are receiving the assistance they need. And keeping in mind that exit strategies are more difficult in some cases, that maybe there's only so much we can take on. But talk amongst yourselves. We'll spend some time discussing each of these different contexts after 30 minutes. Okay? And why don't you two merge with another table? Are there any questions about the exercise? So it's kind of looking at that general brainstorming and what a Food for Peace program would look like within the lens of there are very different contexts that we work in, and all things aren't possible in every context, and all things aren't desirable in every context. So what does it mean, these contexts, in terms of how the program? Each context in a minute, and I think you can either be formal in how you report out on it or informal. It's completely up to you. But first, does anybody have any general comments just about all three contexts? Any general? I'm saying that because I see him with a sheet that says general thoughts. And it wouldn't be fair to cut you off.
We'll start with our general thoughts. So some of the ideas that we discussed is we need to think about how Food for Peace should work to support countries in moving forward to the collaborative model. So that by necessity, you sort of have to first understand where the country is, then sort of understand how it's going to get there. So it's looking at the exit from the very beginning. We also talked about how many countries are in between models. So you have to take that into consideration. There's also the emergency and development distinction. So it's not maybe always appropriate to consider social safety net programming in emergency situations or in development situations. And we don't want to force Food for Peace down a path of having social safety net programming in all of our projects. We need to think about cost effectiveness, so looking at cost per beneficiary levels. Level of need isn't always the same, and sometimes there are different causes of what generates need. There's a good study from the World Bank on social safety nets in Africa in 2013 that I think we can circulate. 2015. Okay, we'll circulate that link. And also interesting to note that it's the school feeding programs are actually the most common of those social safety net programs. That's something to keep in mind.
Do you want to move? Does anyone else have any general thoughts before we move into the individual context? Kind of overarching.
I think we revolved a lot of saying that it's actually not that black and white. I think you just mentioned it in between models, but there might as well be a combination of, you have Pakistan here as constraint, but Pakistan could very well be collaborated because there's a very strong existing safety net, for instance, by the government. So you have both in the same context. So we revolved a little bit about how it depends on your context, and so it's not as black and white in terms of those three models, and we need to stick, or we need to fit into those. Or maybe rather looking at other criteria, saying depending on the context, here's how you can engage in what the value added could be.
Yeah, and just as I think our group came out with a sense that a lot of this depends on what your objectives are. And so a big piece of it isn't just which model this fits into, but whether we think we can actually do social protection or not depends on what we really think is realistic to achieve. And there may be situations where we just conclude that the situation isn't right at the moment to be able to really implement systems of social protection. And that's where we have to do kind of humanitarian assistance, but we can't really do what we would consider a true safety net program.
Okay, good. And point well taken. We really didn't intend for this to be country A fits this and country B fits this, but more just a frame of realizing that all things are not possible in the same environment, and even in highly complex environments, that there are aspects of both. And so how do we start looking at what we can achieve and can't? Any other initial thoughts?
I think this is more of a question for the group. In just thinking back to the brainstorming that we did about government safety net and getting buy-in, I just wonder, and this exercise was both, it could be applied to government or the community level, right? So I guess I just wonder if we're looking at doing a government safety net or working towards that, then shouldn't, I don't know if this is realistic or not, but then shouldn't the partners in their concept notes be demonstrating that they've spoken with the government and the government's amenable to this kind of vision, whether or not the government can do it now, but like, oh, they support this vision that we have. But is that even realistic? Because how many people would be applying for funding, and then the government's going to meet with 15 different partners to have this discussion, and maybe it supports all those visions. The logistics of getting something to Food for Peace that we can honor and fund that supports the government safety net or the community-led social protection. I mean, we find that our partners supposedly have done community assessments or participatory assessments, and these are the activities they've identified. But then really, sometimes when you ground truth it, maybe this wasn't really what they needed, or it wasn't looked at holistically. And so I guess I'm struggling with, yeah, this is all great on paper, and we can identify obstacles and factors for success, but isn't just the fundamental starting point to achieving a safety net, making sure that there's buy-in? And I just don't know
When does that need to happen?
And how does that happen? Is that realistic? So pass it to Paula. Do you have the answers?
First of all, no, I do not have the answers. But secondly, I think you've jumped way ahead of the game. This is really a discussion more of, is this something we should be doing? And if so, what should we be thinking about? Both on the partner side and on UCIT and Food for Peace's side. It is not a call for applications and asking people, please submit, your ideas about how you're going to do this in every country at all. In fact, the answer may be it's not going to be feasible in this country.
No, I agree, but I think, I guess I'm wondering, okay, so how, maybe it's Food for Peace's role, then maybe we find that in this country, this is what we want to do, and we talk to the government, and we say, okay, we're going to support you with safety net. I understand I'm thinking ahead, but I also think this is, as demonstrated by what we're doing in Haiti, this is something that we're trying to move toward. So,
again, I think that that's a little premature, but if it is something that we were looking for in a country, it would be in whatever documentation we put out, the APS, the RFA, whatever. It would be in there only as an option. Those things are not blueprints. They are simply, these are things we're looking at. This is what the country's ready for. From our point of view, what do you think? Is this something you want to work with? Do you have suggestions? So, that's the way it works. It's not as clear. It's not a contract. It's not what you're talking about.
Sorry, I think this is one thing. Let's just let Food for Peace talk amongst themselves for 1 minute, and then we'll come back to you.
getting at what you're talking about, Paula, I don't think this is just an academic exercise. I think it's, is this something that we actually want to operationalize? It's not thinking at the 30,000 foot level about, oh, safety nets and what's food for pieces and our partner's viewpoint on it, but does it make sense for us right down here on the ground? And in order to come up with sort of not a decision, but some, I don't know, some solidified thinking on it, I think you have to look at what Mara is asking, the questions that she is asking. So I hope, I know that we're not just doing this to contribute to the body of knowledge and thought on social protection and safety nets, but should we operationalize it? In what context, and what, and especially, I don't know, I'll just leave it there. Should we, and in what context? And we really don't want to push it where it doesn't belong.
And I would just add too that I think the answer is very different, and I think you prefaced that at the beginning. If we're talking about community-led, then a lot of that does come out of the kind of community analysis that the implementing partner may be conducting. But because of the incredible importance of donor coordination and understanding what Food for Peace's role is, there's a certain amount of role definition that has to happen. It has to come from Food for Peace in their own discussions with the government, with other donors, with other actors that are in that space. So it really isn't up to each implementing partner to go and negotiate with the government and decide what would be an appropriate role for the Food for Peace resources, because it's got to fit into that bigger picture. So in that degree, if we're talking about country-specific information, for example, around this, then I think there has to be a certain amount of information conveyed to implementing partners about this is what's been negotiated, this is the space for carrying out this work in that country. And then beyond that, it's, I think, up to them. So,
yeah, I want to respond to that. Actually, I think we're on the same page.
Yeah.
We're saying it in very different ways. And that is, we're not, right now we're asking, is this the right thing for us to be looking at? This is a strategy that we're working on right now. It's, should we be putting our resources towards developing this and encouraging it and responding to the need in the field? It is not how we're going to operationalize it. That's just not what we're up to now. Now, if we decide, yes, we're going to go ahead with this, you know, and people have good suggestions and so on, then absolutely, anytime programming is going to be involved, there's going to be a lot more, you know, direction and so forth. And you know how the system works. Things go out and say, this is what we're looking for. What can you do? And what are your ideas? And you know, present your proposals and so on. But I don't think that's where we're going today.
And I would just specify too, I don't think we're here talking about should we support social protection, because we do. And we will continue to do so, but how and in what situations are our resources best used? Because we will, no matter what we do, whether it's, you know, whether it's one of these roles or another or a broad gamut of them, there are ways, but it's really about how do we best do it. So, you've been waiting to get a comment across.
Okay. I don't know. I mean, maybe just to kind of wrap it up, I suppose. I mean, I think it's just in response to Mara's original comment is, I mean, I think that, I don't know if it's in a call for proposal or whatnot. I mean, I think that's the role of Food for Peace to figure out if the government is amenable to those types of programs. You know, that's your call, and then you put out your call for proposals. Or you look at the situation and be like, okay, this is the type of proposals we need to ensure that implementing partners do have successful programs. So I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, when you put out your calls, like it's up to you whether or not you think the government is going to accept those programs, and if not, then maybe you need to rethink what your objectives and what you're trying to achieve. But again, I don't think that's the call for implementing partners. That's the role that Food for Peace should play, is whether or not, you know, these programs are viable in this environment.
John? Brian? Okay.
I think Food for Peace, we talked about this at our table, I think Food for Peace and its partners, at some of the basic operational components, have been doing some form of social protection. And I think that this question about should we be focusing on it, or how should we do it, and so forth, I think part of answering that question is about trying to look at what kind of assets and contributions Food for Peace and its partners have already done and have already picked up. And then how can we apply it into different kind of contexts. I think this framing of the three different models is a really helpful way to think about it. So you have all those different kind of environments that you can work on this, and you might have a gold standard one where a government's ready to pick up and try to do a whole social protection nationwide thing, and then you have other ones where you don't have that kind of buy-in in that organization. But nonetheless, I mean, we have some expertise in the targeting and basically the teaming up of trying to get social protection programs underway. So, I think the question kind of is like, okay, well, what are those things that we do, and how can we contribute it to a social protection program in these different kind of models? I think you can develop some very interesting scenarios to figure out how to leverage what's been ongoing in our expertise now. It may not need to be like a regearing of things, but more of a sort of modification of certain applications. Yeah, just one thing I wanted to add when we talk about whether it's Food for Peace going to the government or it's our partner to the government. I think one of the things we need to be thinking about also is that there's a significant difference when we're doing emergency workforce development in terms of our processes and who guides how that works. So in the example of, say, one of our development food assistance programs, of course, we're going to be doing a lot of the legwork ahead of time to figure out what we want and who we're going to be working, who in the government, what ministries we're going to be working with, what we're going to be trying to achieve with the program, and providing kind of broad guidance for our partners to come in for submissions. On the emergency side, it's very different. Often it is kind of partner-led. They know what the capacities are. They're proposing things they're going to do, and we're figuring out whether it's something that's a priority for our resources. And when we talk about social protection, a lot of times this comes into play. We talked a little bit about refugee situations. Often in those types of scenarios, we're providing a lot of social support, and our partners are trying to set up systems. And there are also some other examples where you could say the partners are genuinely trying to set up a social protection system that's going to be protracted. It's not going to be a government system, and it's very much led by what the organizations themselves are trying to do. And so I think in some regard, those are kind of different models as well that we have to be thinking about in terms of what we're going to be doing as Food for Peace.
Just maybe to add to that, and just thinking on other donors and how they approach social protection and how they go about it, and I think the UK government, and UK aid have been quite successful, let's say, in looking at Kenya or Nigeria, for instance, and discussing with the government and then calling for a consortium, a group of partners saying, how would you go about, tell us how you would go about this, and send us a proposal or a plan of action or a strategy. And I think in Kenya it has worked quite interestingly over the last 4 or 5 years, and now the government is totally kind of taking it on board and rolling it out into way bigger coverage. So there is success stories, and it might be interesting, and I assume you already do that probably, but looking at those experiences and talking to your counterparts at the other donors with the EU, with DFID, and yes, they maybe all have the longer term development kind of perspective, but it might just be helpful to inform a framework within which you kind of want to look at that, or set criteria of where can we or where should we kind of intervene.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there is some level of sharing between donors and donor coordination groups here in Washington and at the country level, but I'm a huge learning for content. There should always be. There should be. Okay. Why don't we move on and just compare thoughts? Patrick, anything from the online community before we? Okay. And just look at that constrained model for a minute and just, what did it, why is this, just a minute. Okay, I can't, there we go. Sorry, this is not, if somebody could just check on that, it's not responding anymore. If we look back at the constraint model, you all have to think about, so you'll remember what it means. How does that affect what we can do, what we should do in those environments? And some of it's so obvious, but I think it's helpful to articulate it. Does anyone, any group have any thoughts about that? What are some of the big ideas that we just really need to take away and reach consensus on? I mean, are there...
I think our group, and maybe it's because of the definition of safety net and decomposition approach, we've kind of felt that in those really constrained environments, other than really trying to see if the principle of targeting on the most vulnerable could be drilled down a little bit more than just general distribution, that what we thought in terms of what most of the group and others thought of as safety nets and organized systems were really quite difficult to apply in certain environments. That because you don't have a clear government structure, you have breakup of social order, that it was difficult to do something that would be really called a system in this circumstance. And that while the principle, as we said, moving beyond where possible from just thinking how are we transferring so many tons of food to meet so many beneficiaries, to think about how we could use whatever systems are in place to more properly target that non-cash contributor to the most vulnerable. It was difficult for the table to see what we emerge these situations where we would have something that most people felt, would be defined as social safety.
Thanks. Okay.
Maybe just in response to Alan, we had a discussion around that. On your constraint model, you mentioned Pakistan as an example on the handout.
Yeah, if you notice that it comes from, I think, Alnap, a guide they produced. We didn't write it. But
No, I know, but it's just as an example.
Yeah.
And we would probably say, yes, some areas of Pakistan are definitely constrained, but the government has a system. And you mentioned that as one of your positive examples as well, how you've been working with the government in this context to continue and roll out the kind of the safety net activities. We were talking about supporting the distribution of,
I don't think Pakistan.
you just mentioned earlier, the distribution of
so
tuning, and this is maybe a way of supporting safety net in a constrained system where government has systems existing. So it's not as black and white in terms of any constraint. Syria, yes. I mean, there's probably, as a constrained other context, Syria, you would probably not be able to do or think about social protection at this time. In a northern Pakistan, maybe you are, because there is existing systems, government buy-in and all of that. So it goes back to say maybe it is more about the context, the government, the existing infrastructure or systems, than just classifying. And I'm not saying we're doing it. I'm just saying
I do want to insist to all of the tables, and we talked about this internally. We really don't want you to feel like you have to put a single country in a single box, but to think about the constraining elements that may be in place in a country. And so there are many countries that may have very collaborative aspects and very constraining aspects at the same time. So how does that really, thinking through these, how does that really impact how you can think and the expectations you can have about what we can achieve? And so we're really not trying to be black and white about it, but just use it as a leverage point to discuss and a frame, a way of thinking about these. So, I'm sorry if it did get in the way of some of you thinking about how to talk this through. Okay, sorry.
So I think my comment actually feeds onto what you're saying here. We use the word opportunistic, that the approach needs to be flexible and adaptable and see opportunities where they exist, to work with different types of any systems that exist or actors that are taking part in positive activities that can be capitalized on. So this idea of adaptability in general approaching that type of context.
Okay, so looking for the opportunities and that's what's going to prevent it from being black and white. We can't just cross countries off the map, but looking for those opportunities within the constraining environment. Okay.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think a lot of what we've been talking about here is very much related to the government side of social safety net, social protection. And I think in a constrained environment, my personal opinion would be that we really ought to be thinking a lot more about the community side of it, because to the extent that any of these systems do exist, it's almost always going to be kind of community-led, because there's very little government interest in doing so. So it may be difficult for us to support those systems, but at a minimum, we have to be making sure that our humanitarian systems isn't undermining those systems, because there is something going on to help support, even if it is just very informal. There are systems in place, and we need to be in some way engaging with those, even when we're doing emergency humanitarian systems and can't do safety nets ourselves.
That's an excellent point. Okay, Brigitte. I couldn't help but think about Somalia. And I know that we're doing some very interesting, innovative programming in Somalia, and I wondered maybe if John could speak to that, and if there's any, sorry John to put you on the spot, but if you could talk about social protection and safety net activities that might be going on in Somalia, because I can't wrap my head around the idea of social protection and particularly safety nets in such a context.
Yeah, I think that's it's a very interesting point when you talk about Somalia, because obviously the federal government's capacity is very limited there, and the regional governments have some capacity, and some of them are trying to do something. But it's even within that country, there's very different levels of capacity depending on whether you're talking about the Somalian Puntland government, or if you're talking about areas that are under Amazon, more or less Amazon control, and other areas where Al-Shabaab has a very strong influence. I think we do have partners that are trying to do what they consider to be social safety net programming in Somalia. It's, I think, a big question for us as to whether that's something that we think is viable, and also whether that is something that we do see having PBOs come in and more or less try to take on. It almost goes towards that comprehensive model where you're saying even in a constrained environment, there's some that are trying to do a comprehensive model of providing service provision where the government has almost no capacity. I can't go into a lot of details, but that's really the conflict there, I think, is that in effect you are trying to take a constrained environment and do comprehensive programming anyway.
Okay. In the interest of time, why don't we just move on? Any thoughts from the online groups about, okay, let's talk about then the comprehensive model and how does that change our frame of reference, and maybe one of the big messages here is when you go in and how far do you go in a more comprehensive environment when you know that there is no capacity, limited capacity to take this on. Any thoughts about the comprehensive environment? No?
We just talked about that it might be necessary to kind of have some sort of guideline as to that. Look at that. That's what we discussed, right?
We talked about agencies.
Mm-hmm.
And what would guidelines like that have to take into account?
I don't remember. Not a comment. Oh, do you have a guideline? Because I was just transitioning.
I think the exit transition strategy strikes me as an obvious one for that. If we're going to be doing full service provision of some kind, whether it's specifically for food or it's food and other things, if we're taking on essentially what we would hope the government would one day do, having in mind, or other entities, it might not be the government, maybe you would be hoping that eventually you could restore other systems that would provide coping mechanisms for people. If we're basically replacing a system, then a big question for us is how long does that last, and what would be if you're not setting a timeline to it, a specific end horizon, what are the parameters where we can start phasing it out? How do we start building, transitioning over to more of the cooperative model of that, and what would it take?
Just to add to that, the word timeline, John, our group talked a little bit about the opportunities that are afforded in the comprehensive model as opposed to the constraint with regard to assessments and various analyses. And so if you're looking at a longer timeline where it seems like the cooperation from the government or local actors could be there, and therefore maybe you're starting with a rapid assessment, but you have to keep in mind that after you get going, we really need to be looking at doing market and coping assessments and gap and barrier analyses, kind of moving towards the road to recovery, resilience, development. But along that way, coordination and linking with the government programs or the existing systems, as John noted, within the communities is really important. But I think the timeline there is a time frame for these models is really critical to factor in.
I'll just add something too. It seems like the decision in this situation, since we cannot provide comprehensive safety net systems in every situation that would seem to need them, that there's something like inherently more political or part of larger responses and larger efforts that we become part of, and in deciding that the resources will go to this country, but not over here, because it is so difficult to extract ourselves later that I think it can't only be humanitarian grounds that we would do that. There's usually something larger driving that decision-making process. You look upset, sorry.
No,
Okay.
I'm not upset, but
I mentioned the exit strategy earlier already when we
Yeah.
started. So no, very much in line with that. And I'm just, when you say resource allocation to one or the other, of course there's always going to be decisions on that. But I think in terms of how you look at it will be very different from how at this point of time decisions are made on humanitarian allocation.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes back as well to the objective of your intervention, and not everything that is done might be deserving the title of social protection. It doesn't mean it's wrong, it doesn't mean it should be undervalued. It's a very important intervention still, but it might just not be social protection. And there might be different criteria for what you consider, what the community of practice considers social protection as compared to a humanitarian transfer, a whatever else it might be. So I think it's more about just being clear on what kind of criteria you want to apply on saying, yes, under these conditions, with these objectives, with these capacities, we will engage in social protection. Everywhere else, it is still considered a different type of programming, for instance, you know. I'm not upset, it's my reflection.
Okay.
Yeah, so this isn't going to blow anyone's mind away, but I think that of the three models, the comprehensive model one holds some pretty unique risks and complexity than the other two models. And I think kind of getting to your point, Mara, about the time horizon, I think Food for Peace ought to think about procurement models that can fit each of these environmental models, contextual models. Because in that comprehensive model, I think a cogent and well-orchestrated handoff transition strategy is important. And again, this gets to the idea of like those basic operational components that Food for Peace and its partners have some specialty in. I think if you have, instead of funding ending on, after 1 year because it was an emergency program, if you do have some way to be able to extend some of that funding so you can have a nice handover, and all that investment that went into substituting the internal safety net can then sort of somehow be handed over, or the ongoing community social protection or the government social protection, whichever system is in place, if they can benefit from that investment at the end of the day, that would, I think, be a pretty good use of funds, and in fact costs an extra, 25% of the total award to be able to ensure that that investment is protected. I think that's something worth considering.
Okay. Final words, like what are the opportunities for the collaborative model? Are there collaborative models where we're working? Alan, you're shaking your head.
Well, no, I mean, I think we're talking that Ethiopia is certainly somewhere, if not all the way to the comprehensive model, somewhere between, I mean, the collaborative model, somewhere between. But yeah, Food for Peace isn't working in a lot of them. It would be a fully collaborative model almost by definition. That's going to be a lower middle income country that isn't going to meet the criteria. We talked about some Central America might be where the food insecurity is more a function of income inequality and discrimination, and some of the countries would have enough capacity that you could consider them in the collaborative model area. I mean, it's a really interesting question, which is Food for Peace. And my opening comments, Food for Peace is such an operational entity, and yet some of the best of what it may be able to deliver in this collaborative model is expertise and building systems, but the sort of working with government, providing technical capacity, building systems is I mean, DA people can correct me. I think in the way they think of that's the rest of aid. That isn't DACA. Maybe a little bit the democracy part of DACA, but it isn't DACA. And maybe that needs to change because, again, as I said from the beginning, I don't think anybody's talking about social safety net systems in such a sophisticated way anywhere in all of U.S. aid, or I would argue all of the U.S. government, the way it's being talked about here. So there's a lot to offer.
On behalf of all of Food for Peace, thank you. Well, there are some great minds, not mine, that went into designing some good questions.
Maybe just hearing what Alan just said and looking again at our models, I think there's as well a consideration on your constrained model. It might be way more food related to Food for Peace. You feel more comfortable there as well, probably in that zone. On the cooperative model, there might be a shift to rather saying, this is way more than just food focused, to go into livelihoods, to go into a larger, call it well-being, living space. So it's way beyond just food because you're talking about other health, education, and all of that. And I'm not saying you need to become livelihoods for people, but in terms of considering the objective, again, there might be things where there are certain elements you need to consider internally, saying, okay, how far are we able to push it as well, in terms of away from the food focus only into saying, yes, we're happy to contribute to the larger well-being, the household economy, and all of that.
Sometimes I think we should change the name of our office because I think there is still out there, even within probably all of USAID, this idea that we focus, if not exclusively, almost exclusively on food, and we do way more than food. However, I do think we have a role to play, and certainly in Ethiopia, our Food for Peace colleagues there, they played an enormous role in the design and implementation of the Parental Safety Net program. So, however, I think it does need to roll out within aid, this whole idea of social protection and safety nets within aid and within the U.S. government writ large, including state, including USDA. So I think right now we're going it alone, Food for Peace is, and we have a strong role to play as we did in Ethiopia, but it needs to grow and be not just our own sort of initiative. It needs to be bigger than.
Other comments? Otherwise, it's time for a break. How do you leave it? We do have some discussion to do, some small groups. We'll be digging down a little more into exit and transition, what that means, do no harm to the communities and the community systems that we're working amongst and within. 15 minutes for a break now, so we'll come back at about 10 after 11, and we'll, and in fact, I think come back and sit at a different table than you sat at before. Get some new voices to talk with some other people in the room. So just choose a different table, any table, when you come back. Okay, so everybody's at their table. There are discussion questions on each table. Each table has a different discussion question. There should be handouts. Here we go. So make sure each table has a set of handouts. I think online you're going to discuss question 1. 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to have one topic that is, or 2 topics that are repeated. But the instructions are fairly simple. Small group discussion, you have about half an hour to discuss. And in this case, let's be a little bit more formal in the report out, but we'll have time to discuss each question separately. Again, there are 3 very different questions, but they get at questions. They get at issues of sustainability and transition, one of them is about complementary programming, enhancing the effectiveness of safety nets with complementary programming, or how safety nets can enhance the effectiveness of other programming. And the last one is more of a do no harm approach, really drilling down a little bit more into how do we make sure that we bolster and support the local systems that are in place. So again, you have about half an hour, so let's keep going until that clock up there says 11:45. And let me know if you have any questions along the way. Thanks.
Something slightly obvious, which is that the design phase needs to, of course, integrate thinking about how the programming will end as well as how it will ramp up. And the government buy-in, to the extent that it's possible, needs to be worked through. And we understand that we're looking at a variety of contexts, from the constrained to the cooperative context. So looking at all different range of possibilities of what exactly can be anticipated in terms of government capacity. But in any case, we felt that there were some lessons learned from some experiences. Haiti was mentioned, the current DFAC programming, where they're building databases and a targeting system, doing a lot of staff training, and that these activities are really important for assuring the transfer. We discussed the fact that it's important for Food for Peace programming to demonstrate that what is being done actually is of support to the beneficiaries, having an impact evaluation. In the case of Haiti, is thought to be very helpful for justifying to the government why this type of investment will be important in the future going forward, and this would support the transition as well. Okay, and going back, just saying that in the planning phase, it's very important to understand what the gaps are that exist, whether they're policy or funding gaps, different types of capacity gaps exist, and then making sure that the program is designed to address what the deficiencies are and to strengthen them over time so that government partners and other organizations will be in a position to assume those responsibilities. We discussed the importance of an effective and efficient targeting strategy to again, demonstrate that this is a type of programming that is worth investing in and that can be done well and isn't going to lead to resentment and other difficulties. Food for Peace can also pilot approaches to making this type of programming attractive and viable for government investment through exploring opportunities with local procurement, because governments may be more interested in making investments if it's something that's going to generate economic benefit for the country as a whole. And yeah, just to highlight again the importance of demonstrating through its programming of Food for Peace is demonstrating transparency and efficiency with local procurement or with the overall approach. It's more likely to be taken up by the government or other actors afterwards. And of course, stating some of the obvious, but there has to be a gradual transfer phase out where other entities assume parts of the programming over time, and it's not the door closes one day and everybody is left to manage things alone.
Just to add to that, I think a big thing that we talked about was really the kind of demonstrating impact, demonstrating how the systems work. That Part of this is on the M&E side of, when we do these pilots, providing tangible benefits, showing that it's cost effective, showing that that you can have these effects so as to make it attractive to the government to pick up. And also, we talked about the transparency side of that as well, is that when you create these systems, you can create them in ways that maybe they wouldn't come into being if the government was setting it up itself. So I think there's a significant advantage for us on that.
Just one minor thing, which is just about, if it's feasible to determine valid graduation criteria, that might help in, sort of making it clear that, okay, the percentage of people who are in this program over years can possibly shrink if other aspects of your social sector support are picking up. If people are beginning to benefit economically, whatever, you might be able to graduate certain people out of this program. So giving some thought to that as well.
One more from the last one. We also talked a little bit about the phased handover idea, that often when we're doing kind of a cooperative model with the government, that the easiest way to make this work is that maybe we start out doing a very high percentage of it, and then over time you go from doing 100% to 80 to 70 to 60, et cetera. That often seems to be the way that it tends to work.
Great. Why don't we go straight to the online group?
Okay, we're going to hear from Mara Russell.
Hi, everyone. So we talked a little bit about some of the models that we'd seen of transition. World Vision talked about assisting with safety nets and school feeding programs in Ghana through a national campaign with WFP and NGOs supplementing what the government's attempting to do, and then the rollout and handover to the government by assisting local governments to sort out budget requirements, planning, and more. Debbie Walton shared about that. She didn't really have much active experience with it, but what she was aware of was that, in fact, the government itself is taking a lot more of the initiative and actually doing a lot of the work that needs to be done, which is actually quite positive, she said, in terms of, the capacity there. So in that particular case, I think, one of the good things that's coming out of it is the government taking the lead. I guess the question that comes up then is, are they actually in receiving mode in terms of being able to take advice, review, technical input, and so forth, as well as ensuring that they're responsive to the needs that they're reaching. I suppose that's always a question of ensuring, to what extent, there's kind of a balance there. To what extent can you actually be guiding in that way? Another example that was featured by, that was mentioned by Christy and Joan, was that the TOPS FSN network knowledge sharing meeting for Asia in Dhaka in early March. At that meeting, the Suahara project in Nepal will be sharing some of their work in bringing nutrition services to groups which are officially designated as disadvantaged groups by the government, with expectation of some safety net social services being provided. And we expect participants from Bangladesh will share some of their experiences in their context. I think what that talks about is how do you ensure that government safety nets will accurately and effectively target the right people? And that is always a challenge, but it also it does kind of seem to in many ways enhance the government approach if they're really exhibiting an active interest in ensuring that the people in greatest need are being reached. The question is then, how do you build accountability into that system? And certainly that is something that in the Bangladesh context, at least from the standpoint of Shuhardo 2 with CARE, there's been a lot of focus on social accountability and responsiveness in that program, and probably something that still could be expanded further. In Haiti, CARE is working through the Corée La Vie program with WFP and Action contre la Femme, as well as I think World Vision now is also joining. And we're working with government on getting them to house a safety net program. We have already worked with the government to identify what are the criteria for the program, so they've bought into that. And we do have a system in place for targeting those vulnerable households and for them receiving vouchers. And that's making, that is actually making a big difference. And they, I think there's some ownership as far as the government is concerned, but the government is not as strong as it could be in terms of the local level. So there's a lot of working with local community-based organizations through help desk to provide an accountability mechanism, a complaint mechanism, so that if there are exclusion or inclusion errors, that those are addressed. And, people can come in and make a complaint, and then each one of those are being verified. And the issue, though, underlying all this, so the system is working, but getting the government to actually actively participate in the system is kind of difficult, because the government capability has kind of declined over the years as NGO capability has increased. So creating the proper incentives and capacity at the government level, as well as providing the funding, ensuring the funding is there within the government to implement that system is, continues to be a challenge. And I think that may be a challenge in other places where the mindset has been, well, the NGOs will come in and do it, rather than build up local capability. But those of you who have worked with the CNSA also know that they have a very good early warning system, which can allow for a rapid expansion of that safety net system once it's in place. One would hope, though, that, once again, then there's this need for maintaining those accountability systems and so forth. Now, one thing that was kind of interesting that we got to later on at the end of our discussion was this whole idea that VSLs can play a safety net role. We were not able to, nobody on the call really had an example of that, so if anybody has that in the room, it would be interesting to see. But certainly one of the most successful kinds of safety nets that exist out there, because people just, if you want to find an activity that always exceeds its targets, it's VSLs. And VSLs generally have these social assistance funds, or, funds that are there that people contribute as kind of, social welfare in case people need to fall back on them. And those funds generally can provide a very good safety net focus. But sometimes what will happen maybe as part of a resilience activity is there may actually be a community level fund. It may not be a VSL generated fund, but it may be something that is developed within the community to address those extraordinary needs. And then Joan raised this issue about the fact that there may be community-based, faith-based safety net systems that already exist. And she mentioned one in East Africa where there was an attempt to introduce a parallel system without taking into account a system that already existed. And I think that kind of brought out the idea that if there is a system that exists, that we should be very cognizant of that system. If anything, perhaps the most that we should do is see if there are ways to ensure that it's targeted appropriately, and if there's any, anything else, just to ensure that it's reaching the poorest people. And, you know, if there's anything else that, you know, where it needs to be strengthened, or perhaps even the opportunity to replicate such a system within, say, a similar social milieu, that, you know, might be something we could provide some support with or capacity building around, but certainly would not require an additional system. I think sometimes, just a comment on my own, we tend to take into account the lack of capacity that exists in an area rather than the existing capacities and build on them. And I think this is an illustration of where we don't want to do harm by replicating, but taking into account and supporting systems that exist. I think that's it. Is there anything else that anybody from my group feels that I missed or would like to contribute, either by chat or by voice?
Okay, great. Thank you, Meryl, and the rest of the group. And I think that was a comprehensive answer that started moving into the discussions that some of the other groups had as well, so it's a good segue. Let's go to the second question.
Working on it.
Uh-oh, it's not working again. Okay, let me read it aloud for those of you that did not have the question. Complementary programs. Can synergies be created between social protection activities and our work in other sectors? Do complementary activities have the potential to increase the impact of social protection programs? If so, how? And do some activities have more potential than others? Conversely, can social protection strengthen the impact of our work in other sectors? If so, how? And if this is particularly true in some sectors more than others, or with some social protection interventions? Okay, so who had question 2? Table right up front here. Okay.
So can synergies be created between social protection activities and other sectors? And we said yes, and looked at health as one example. So in places where you have a reliable transfer system in place, you only give it to the beneficiary if that beneficiary goes to the clinic, for example. Same thing for vaccinations, going to schools, for school feeding programs. It all depends on what you're trying to achieve and the environment where you're operating. So it could also be a part of the management and supply chain aspect that involves other sectors. So say supply chain for vaccines, predicting stock outages, and asking yourself the question, how well is the system functioning for delivery? How do some systems, some activities have more potential than others? We emphasize enhancing compliance with conditional transfers. Increasing household income increases dietary diversity and education, for instance. So that's one kind of set of activities you could focus on. We suggested doing one transfer that focuses on household income, but you need to constantly gather evidence of whether it's having the impact that you want. The aspect of sustainability is where we are still not having the desired results. So we mentioned like school feeding programs. Once the funding or the food runs out, that's it. There isn't anything to really pick up and take the place. So we asked the question, you have to ask the question, is there the political will to continue funding these activities that we start? We talked a bit about community-based and traditional social safety net systems, and we emphasize that climate change and conflict are driving the breakdown of these existing systems. Another important aspect under this is indexing of benefits. So how do you verify loss of crops, for instance, if you're talking about a crop insurance activity? We did identify some success in village savings groups, which the other group had mentioned. These are generally successful in individual crises, but the moment that the whole community is affected, then they're simply overwhelmed. We also need to take advantage of opportunities to, quote-unquote, nationalize our social protection activities, but decide what the end goal is. Do we want to replace or reinforce what's already there. We didn't identify any sectors where it isn't appropriate to have synergies with social protection intervention, but working with the national government is tricky, certainly because of corruption issues.
Yeah, we had some of the same things, but we'll try to be very quick. Yes, we thought there was working.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm rarely having a problem be heard. Can synergies be created? Yes. Do complementary activities have the potential? Yes. And we would have said, before we got into the sectors, the key to whether they have a potential to increase the impact of social protection programs is the extent to which whatever the complementary activity addresses the underlying risk and vulnerability that reduces the individual's need to have the social protection in the future. That's how it, so whether it's a livelihood program, there are different ways to do that. And if so, how do some activities have more potential than others? And I think we came very similar to the other group. I mean, based on the research out there, conditional nutritional programs have proven successful both on cash transfers and food transfers, school feedings in many cases linked with education. And although they're more diverse, there's at least experiences where food for asset programs linked to training, and particularly small-scale watershed management or small-scale farmer conservation have shown to have an impact in terms of improving behaviors. How can social protection strengthen the impact of our work in other sectors? And I think the principle we thought about is, in what situations is the absolute absence of income to meet daily needs for the most vulnerable the principal obstacle for them to taking advantage of broader development opportunities? In other words, you don't necessarily need to link social protection with say a farmer's seed and irrigation program for farmers who say, yeah, this makes sense and I can invest in this. But for the very vulnerable who says, look, I understand this makes sense. I just can't risk anything to save today to make tomorrow because I need to feed my family today. And to the extent that social protection schemes can meet immediate income needs to allow people to take advantage of development opportunities on other sectors, then social protection can enhance the impact on the other sectors. And in terms of sectors, again, we tended to answer the last question, is this between some sectors more than others? Again, kind of the same sectors that we talked about in the first slide.
Great, thank you. Why not? Yeah, okay. All right, and I just got to find that time is up, but we still have another group. And there's only one group to report out on this question, though, that is not to imply that this is not an important question. It's just the way it worked out. So social protection takes many forms, from the national to the local, including traditional support mechanisms that help vulnerable groups through times of crisis. With the influx of resources from international food assistance, there is a potential to undermine traditional schemes, and it's something that's come up multiple times today. How can we ensure that the social protection interventions and programs we directly support will in turn enhance and support traditional or other community-level safety nets? How can we best understand the traditional systems in place and shape our programs accordingly to support, not duplicate or diminish, the potential of what's already there? So group 3, it's come up a couple of times today, but...
So we're group 3. In the overall context of the do no harm discussion, we kind of group things into a couple of areas. To begin with, in overall risk management, it's having to be realistic in that approach. So we discussed elements of what are really the irreparable levels of harm that must be avoided and are universal, and then what are the elements that may not be appropriate but are somewhat repairable over the context of program operation that you will learn and identify through your feedback mechanisms in your program. And then another aspect in overall risk management is having the patience to identify these issues and also understand how the power dynamics or decision dynamics may happen and affect these types of considerations. From there, we then talked about a way to influence this or identify populations and support structures that may already exist is really through the overall program design process, and the guidance that influences the program design likely will help determine the type of project and its appropriate identification. So for instance, we talked about it's important to have ground truthing in place to identify these vulnerable populations that may not be readily apparent. The assessments that are done to inform this program design needs to be context dependent, depending upon how much time you have to implement your project. These assessments can often be quick, don't necessarily have to be laborious and time intensive, and therefore it will greatly improve the identification of these populations. And then if there is more time, then in supporting that culture of information use to be able to have the appropriate level of information to identify those societal partners and then the dependent structures that may be impacted by this thing. And then also, just when the program launches, clear messaging strategies, clear targeting can also help avoid confusion within the society or impacting these groups. And I think one other area is who Food for Peace decided to partner with really can have an impact on what type of groups are going to be impacted. So ensuring that there is some aspect of local engagement who has the trust to support these social protection programs, and then ensuring that the local partner has the competency and capacity to do it. Although they may have the trust, can they actually run it, and balancing those considerations. And then finally, I think it talks about just in the reporting phase that reporting isn't this one-off aspect that we do, but making sure that there's an open, continuous feedback loop for maybe marginalized populations to be able to bring up aspects of programming that may be undesirable. Getting to that element that we talked about in the beginning is in overall risk management. What is it that were acceptable and what is it that isn't, and how do we have mechanisms in place to identify that? So really, maybe on the implementation side is for Food for Peace, which was confirmed in the group, having an open culture of accepting what we consider, quote, failures or non-desired elements of the program, but being able to discuss that and bring that up so that it can be adapted. And that's kind of basically our discussion around that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And that was really great input. And I said the same thing last week. Thank goodness we're doing this on a remote basis as well, because it means that there is a recording. And last weekend I sat down and listened to that recording again, because you just can't catch it all. And so many smart ideas were exchanged last week, so many smart ideas exchanged today, and we really will. Between Food for Peace and between talks and efforts to document this, we're going to capture as many of those smart ideas as possible. Sheila's going to take us through a closing exercise now. We're rapidly running out of time, otherwise we would have had a little more cross-group discussion around some of these issues, but we have made we've made tremendous progress today in starting to articulate some of the issues we need to think through and really reach consensus on at a strategic level. And so, heartfelt thanks to all of you for your ideas and your time. And I'll hand it over to Sheila.
Thank you, Joan. Okay, I promise you I will get you up here in time. One thing we pride ourselves at TOPS is we start on time and end on time, not necessarily in those order, but we try. So the last part, now that we've talked a lot about social protection, safety net, kind of builds a framework around it. Now we kind of want to get your guys' ideas on examples of possible successful social protection safety net programs in your programs, or ones you have heard of. So we would like your ideas, what these entail, and most importantly, why were they successful? Why did they work in these types of contents? How did they really add to the environment of a safety net? So please raise your hand. Madeline or Michelle will get a microphone to you. Online also. Anybody have an example? Come on, don't be shy. There you go. That's good.
Well, I think just one starting point is that Nara identified several from a number of different contexts in her readout. So that's a good starting point. Definitely.
I can only speak about Ethiopia and the Productive Safety Net program that started in 2005. The food and cash transfer component that supported or underlies that program has gone incredibly far to rehabilitate landscapes in Ethiopia, land that was previously completely degraded and not at all arable has been revived, and if you get a chance to go to Ethiopia, you will be amazed at one watershed where the productive safety net program was being implemented, and look at a watershed, in this direction where there was no work, and it's quite extraordinary. So I think there are a lot of valuable lessons to be learned, and I think the point that was critical here was to also learn from failures. And I think more and more, Food for Peace is very open to hearing about unsuccesses. We won't call them failures, but let's call them unsuccesses. And so hopefully we'll keep moving forward with that and collecting information about those stories as well.
Another good word for failure is that you try, because you can't succeed if you don't try. So, good on you if you just at least try. So we've got this gentleman up here.
Thank you. I'm from Ethiopia, and I had a chance to work on GetNP project. I would like to support your idea. There are many successful stories there. It's mainly because of the programs were owned by the government. The government was up to the grassroots level. They are working with a full commitment. And the community was also participating in designing the programs, implementing the programs. And on top of that, they have the skill how to conserve the land. So they have got through on-job training. They were doing proper soil and water conservation, afforestation programs, and so on. So all those skills were successfully transferred to the people on the ground. So that makes it, I think, successful. And people, they have the attitude of changing the environment and finally back to the normal farming practices because of the level of water is rising, more of irrigation development, water harvesting, and so on. So it was a combination of things. So there was no single magic bullet, but it's a combination of the leadership, the community, the skill, and the capacity building. Thank you.
Great. Anybody else? Okay, I actually have a follow-up question for this gentleman. You talked about the fact that there was success in transferring the skills, and that's how the program kind of succeeded. Could you talk maybe elaborate a little bit more on the strategies that were used to transfer skills? Because that's something that is pretty crucial to getting a lot of things, sustainability, social net, safety nets on the floor, is making sure the people that we're trying to benefit actually learn and grow.
Thank you. I think there was a clear plan from the government partners, like the Ministry of Agriculture is the one who owns the programs, collaborate with non-governmental organizations. So there was continued training program. So there was also a voluntary from the community, so they are willing to work for free. They were on the front of that development activity. So it's routine, but gradually people, they were able to get that kind of skill through working on the field. So you get amazed on the type of control they can do it. So you don't need, you need the trainer, you need the engineer to guide them, but once they have that kind of skill, they can construct a proper structure, proper bench terraces, and so on.
Great, thank you. That's great information. If I could add something from the very early days of the safety net, one of the interesting and very successful learning experiences were visits of officials or of the participants themselves from one area to another area to see how another area was handling a certain problem. They shared information very well and became so clear. As soon as they saw what the other people were doing, they knew, oh, we can do that, or it won't work for us, but it's great for you. Whatever, just the sharing by visiting different areas was very useful. Great point. Anyone else? Anyone online?
This is from Mara Russell here. She said that the best productive safety nets are the ones that are not just run by the government and the NGOs, but also owned by the communities. The value of the productive part of the safety net must be more valuable to people than the payment they receive, or the infrastructure or other benefits will not be maintained. Often communities will let structures fall apart because they only want the safety net. And if it's in the case that infrastructure keeps falling apart, this is an indication that the structures are not owned by the community. Often that may mean that a non-conditional safety net may be more cost-effective.
And if I may be so bold to interject, I think that kind of goes back to a little bit about making sure that you train the community and also having that immediate buy-in from the community by doing site visits and to really have them look and evaluate because they know their situations best, whether or not something's going to work for them. That's just my opinion, though.
That's you're good. Okay. So, one point to add on community ownership. It's mainly they put their own system, they have their own bylaws when they own the program. So you don't need to have external funding to protect that environment, that conservation. So when they own it, they maintain it, they look after, they penalize people who bypass the laws. And also they benefit from the conservation. Normally they have huge production of grass, the honey production will be increased, so they are the ones to benefit, and they have something to be shared out of that environment. So they are willing to protect and to keep it up to that level, at least in that context in Ethiopia.
Thank you.
Just one more thing I was going to add to that is that I think one of the things that I'm kind of getting out of this is that it does need to be demand-driven to some degree. That in effect, not just from the government but also the community is figuring out what they actually want and making sure that that's what we're designing. And a part of that means being culturally appropriate. Part of it means being in tune with people, doing lots of discussions with the community, doing discussions with the government officials. But yeah, if you're going to put in place a social safety net, it has to fill a need. It has to be specifically what they're trying to, what they're reaching out for, like what they, maybe they couldn't necessarily conceptualize it exactly the way you would, but trying to get at what actually will be a benefit to help make sure these people are secure. And I think when we talk about food security, it's not, it isn't just about food. It's about making sure people reliably know how they're going to be able to sustain themselves. They don't have to fear about what food is, where their food is going to be coming from. And that's where a lot of what we talk about livelihoods comes in. So I think when we engage in safety nets, that's really what we're trying to do, and it's hopefully what some of our more successful programs do.
Thank you, John.
Go ahead, Brigitte. I think Mira raised a really, really important point, and it is true that to some extent we do have to fund the rehabilitation or the maintenance of the structures that are built. We see that in our partners' budget sometimes, budgeting for maintenance of existing structures. And I think what's really important is to have in place user groups and turn it over to specific user groups. So for example, a water group will collect fees and therefore be able to maintain structures that are built under the safety net. It's not always that easy as forming a water users group, a road users group. So that's a really important point that Mara made, and then another important point that John raised is that the demand has to be driven by the community. So if you have someone top down saying, oh, this is what we're going to do, and it's not seen as so needed by the community, you're not going to be as successful.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate some of that because for me, two big messages are just the link between social protection and social accountability, which I just didn't realize social accountability.
hadn't thought, but that's a fundamental. It has to be there for that demand-driven, the ability to really meet the needs. And as Alan said, the social protection system has to be meeting the actual drivers of their food insecurity. I mean, it has to be addressing those. And the only people that can tell us that really and truly are the populations themselves that we're working with. But also the need for exit strategies from the very start. That infrastructure, we can't be building infrastructure and worrying about what that user group is going to be or how it's structured after we build the infrastructure. It has to be there from the beginning and designed in cooperation with the community. So really important points raised today.
Thank you. Okay, final thought from Brian, please.
Yeah, sorry. Nothing huge. I think this has been a great conversation. PSNP is clearly a sort of a top-notch safety net program example, so I think that's definitely one to highlight. I think the points made about community investment in this is really important. I did just want to kind of throw in a little bit of experience from, say, the children's side about being sure to link in local governments to help with some of these complementary activities. I'm always impressed. There's an amazing amount of capacity in a lot of the local ministries, but they don't really have the resources to unleash all that capacity. And these kind of programs can really kind of help bring that into full circle. And I think it will support the longevity and sustainability of some of these assets that are maybe being created or behavior changes that we're trying to create with the complementary activities. So anyway, that's...
Thank you. Thank you all again. This has been a really great session, a lot of great ideas. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. I would like to thank you all for coming out, and especially thanks to Joan and John for giving some great talks and leading some great sessions to really kind of getting us to flow those ideas. And also Paula too. How dare me forget Paula. So thank you to everyone else. Also very quickly, the TOPS events team, they're the ones running the online portion, taking notes, running microphones. And online is kind of a very much unspoken hero of planning these events, Christy Tabai. She's the gender specialist with TOPS, and she's been very instrumental in organizing these, so thank you, Christy. And just a couple of quick reminders. We will be posting everything online, and we will be sending out through email reminders to everyone who's registered, plus the FSN Network community, links for the page where you can get the recording, other materials, and eventually some notes for you. Also, we'll be posting an email address where if you have additional questions or comments you'd like to contribute, please go ahead and post those, and we will make sure we get those to Food for Peace for you. And finally, don't forget, February 11th is confidence-sensitive programming. It'll be until 2 o'clock, but we do feed you both breakfast and lunch, so there's some incentive to come. So we hope you will be here. Yeah. Very good. So we hope you can come and join us, and thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day. Yes, Brigitte.
One final announcement. If anyone's going to or near the Ronald Reagan building and would like a ride, I have a minivan, so I can take some people.
Yes, Brigitte can drive you home if you're in DC and work at the Ronald Reagan building.